Welcome to Fireside at Willow Creek, a gentle story where the night hums softly with the sound of crackling firewood and whispering trees. Tonight, we journey to a quiet cabin nestled by a slow, winding creek where the warmth of the fire melts away the chill of the world outside. As the embers glow and the stars shimmer above the water, let your thoughts drift, your breathing slow, and your body unwind. This is your time to rest, to let go of the day and slip into the calm embrace of sleep by the fireside at Willow Creek. The first chill of evening rolled down through the pines that lined Willow Creek, brushing across the cabin porch like a whisper. The light was soft and amber, the kind that lingers at the edge of day, and the air smelled faintly of wood smoke and damp earth. Inside the cabin, the fire had already been lit, its glow flickering against the wooden walls in a dance of gold and shadow. Evelyn stood by the window, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. Steam rose lazily toward her face, carrying with it the warmth of cinnamon and honey. Outside, the last curve of sunlight was fading beyond the trees, leaving behind a sky streaked with violet and pearl. The creek, winding quietly below the slope, caught the reflection of the fading light and shimmered like liquid glass. The cabin at Willow Creek had been in her family for decades, a hidden place where time moved differently. Her grandparents had built it by hand, plank by plank, long before phones and screens had turned the world restless. Every beam still carried the faint scent of pine resin and smoke, and every step across the floor gave a gentle creak that spoke of years gone by. She'd come here alone this autumn, seeking rest after months that had blurred together. Deadlines, city noise, the constant pulse of something urgent. The moment she'd stepped out of her car and into the cool, clean air of the woods, she felt something in her chest loosen. Here, everything slowed. Here, everything breathed. As dusk settled, she moved to the fireplace and knelt to add another log. Sparks leapt upward, tiny fireflies of orange and gold, before dissolving into the dark. The crackle was steady, rhythmic, a sound that had always comforted her, even as a child. Her grandmother used to say that fire was like a living friend. If you listen closely, Evie, you'll hear it telling stories. So she did. She sank into the old armchair near the hearth, its fabric worn but soft, and tucked her feet beneath a quilt that still smelled faintly of cedar. The flames shifted, curling around the wood in graceful arcs, whispering and sighing. The sound filled the room, gentle, steady, timeless. Outside, the wind brushed through the pines with a hushed voice of its own. Somewhere an owl called. The world beyond the windows had turned to silver, the moon rising over the creek, scattering its reflection in soft ripples. Evelyn closed her eyes and let her thoughts drift. The fire popped softly, the warmth radiating through the room in slow waves. Her breathing fell into rhythm with it, in out, as though the cabin itself was breathing alongside her. She remembered being little, curled up in this very spot while her grandmother sat in the rocker nearby, humming lullabies older than either of them could name. She remembered the way the shadows would dance along the walls, turning into shapes that looked like stories, explorers in the snow, dancers by the firelight, trees that swayed like dreamers. Back then, she believed every flicker of flame held a secret. Now, years later, she felt that same soft wonder stirring again. She reached for her journal, the same one she carried everywhere for years, its pages filled with half-finished poems and sketches of places she wanted to visit. She opened to a blank page and wrote slowly, her pen moving in the amber glow. The fire remembers what we forget. The warmth that finds us when we think we've gone cold. The quiet between the crackles. The stories that live in the light. The words felt right. Not profound, not perfect, but honest. She set the pen down and leaned back, letting her eyes drift to the window again. The creek shimmered faintly in the moonlight, and for the first time in months, Evelyn felt at ease. The clock on the wall ticked softly. Somewhere outside, a branch shifted in the wind. Inside, the warmth deepened. It wrapped around her like a slow embrace, unhurried, unspoken. She thought about how far she'd come, How every loss, every sleepless night, every long drive that brought her here had been a kind of quiet unfolding. Maybe that was what the fire had been trying to tell her all along, that healing wasn't sudden. It was a slow burning, a gentle thaw. The flames dipped and sighed, their light glancing across the old photographs on the mantel. Black and white memories of her grandparents laughing beside the creek. A summer picnic from decades ago. Her mother as a child with wild hair and a grin too big for her face. She smiled. The kind of smile that comes from somewhere deep, the kind that carries both ache and peace. Outside, the night grew thicker, but not darker. The moon shone bright above the trees. The fire glowed within, and somewhere between them, time folded softly in on itself. Evelyn closed her eyes again and listened to the wind, to the water, to the fire. It all blended into a lullaby, ancient and kind. Her breathing slowed, her thoughts unspooled like thread, and the cabin settled into silence so deep it almost hummed. The night at Willow Creek had begun, and it promised dreams woven with light and warmth. The fire had burned low by now, its heart a deep orange, like embers resting after a long song. Evelyn stirred slightly, her eyes fluttering open as the sound of the wind brushed gently against the cabin. It wasn't loud or insistent. It was tender, like the world outside was breathing just to keep her company. The scent of pine and smoke hung in the air, a scent that had always meant home. She rose quietly from the armchair and walked to the window. The moon had climbed higher now, glowing above the creek like a patient guardian. She could see her reflection faintly against the glass. Tired eyes softened by the firelight, hair falling loose over her shoulders. She didn't look sad anymore, just quiet. On the porch, the old rocking chair creaked as the wind nudged it. Evelyn smiled faintly. Her grandfather had built that chair himself, carving initials into the armrest when he was young. Every time she came here, she could almost feel his presence, the steady rhythm of his voice, the smell of sawdust and tobacco that used to cling to his flannel shirts. She slipped on her cardigan and opened the door. The night air wrapped around her in a cool embrace. The world outside shimmered, silver moonlight on wet leaves, 1,000 tiny droplets glittering like scattered stars. The creek murmured softly, flowing over stones smooth as glass. She stepped down the wooden stairs and onto the path that led to the water's edge. The earth was damp beneath her feet, and each step made a quiet crunch in the moss. Crickets chirped softly in the distance. Everything felt alive, yet still. When she reached the creek, she sat on a flat rock and looked into the water. It caught the reflection of the moon perfectly, rippling it whenever a leaf drifted by. She leaned forward and whispered softly, as though to the moon itself. "Thank you for keeping this place." It wasn't a prayer exactly, but something close. She didn't know who she was thanking, her grandparents, the earth, the quiet itself, but it felt right. The creek babbled in response, a sound both ancient and new. Evelyn watched the current move and thought about how water always finds a way forward, even when blocked. It flows, it carves, it endures. And in that thought, she found a small comfort that settled deep in her chest. After a while, she stood and followed the path that curved around the trees. The forest here was old, willows that leaned toward the water as if in conversation, birches with bark like parchment, and the faint rustle of creatures hidden in the brush. Every sound was soft, almost reverent. When she reached the far end of the path, she came upon something she hadn't noticed before, a small wooden bench, half covered in ivy. It must have been here for years, forgotten. She brushed away the leaves and sat down. From here, she could see the entire sweep of the creek as it curved beneath the moonlight. The stillness of it all made her think of how busy life had been, how the city lights had drowned the stars, how days had blurred together until she'd forgotten what silence even sounded like. But here, silence wasn't empty. It was full of the sound of water, the creak of branches, the heartbeat of the world itself. She tilted her head back and closed her eyes. The smell of the night filled her senses, wet pine, smoke, faint earth. It felt like the forest was whispering to her, the same way her grandmother used to hum lullabies when Evelyn was small. She could almost hear her grandmother's voice now, floating in her memory. When the world feels too heavy, Evie, find a quiet place. The heart knows how to rest if you give it time. Evelyn let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The creek continued to hum softly beside her, its sound mingling with the faint crackle of the fire from the cabin in the distance. The two sounds, flame and water, blended together, warm and cool, steady and soft. She smiled faintly, realizing how perfect that balance was. Maybe that's what she had been missing. Not silence, but harmony. She stayed there for a long while, not thinking, not planning, just being. The night sky stretched endlessly above her, and the stars, one by one, began to appear. Small lanterns hung across eternity. Eventually, she returned to the cabin. The fire had dimmed to a deep, glowing bed of embers, but it was still warm. She stirred it gently with the iron poker, adding one last log. The flames caught, rising again in soft curls. The warmth reached her cheeks, and she could almost swear she heard her grandmother's laughter in the crackle. She poured herself another cup of tea, now lukewarm but sweet, and curled once more into the armchair. The quilt was heavy on her lap, and her eyes began to grow soft with sleep. As she drifted, she dreamed of life, of stars reflected in the creek, of her grandmother's voice calling softly through the trees, of lanterns that never went out. The cabin seemed to sigh, the fire settling lower, the world slowing around her. The night deepened, rich and blue, and sleep came like a tide. Evelyn's breathing grew slow, steady, peaceful. The firelight flickered across her face, painting her in gold. Outside, the creek kept singing, and the forest leaned closer, listening. Willow Creek dreamed with her, and somewhere in that dream, the world was whole again. The first soft light of dawn crept gently through the cabin windows, painting the wooden walls with the faintest hue of gold. Outside, mist clung low to the ground, curling through the willows like something alive. The fire had burned down to glowing coals, breathing out a faint warmth that filled the air with a tender hum. Evelyn stirred beneath the quilt, her eyes fluttering open to the calm of morning. For a long moment, she didn't move, she simply listened. The hush of rain had returned, tapping lightly on the roof, trickling down the glass in delicate streams. It wasn't heavy rain. It was soft, rhythmic, almost like a lullaby continuing from the night before. She smiled faintly, realizing she hadn't slept this peacefully in years. The kind of sleep that didn't just rest the body, but soothed the spirit. Stretching gently, she rose from her chair and padded barefoot across the creaking floorboards. Her reflection drifted past the fogged window pane, pale morning skin, hair loose from sleep, a quiet softness in her face that hadn't been there before. She poured water into the kettle and set it over the faint coals, watching the tendrils of steam rise slowly. The smell of damp wood and ashes wrapped around her like a shawl. When the tea was ready, she stepped outside onto the porch. The air was cool, almost sharp with the scent of pine needles and wet bark. The world looked reborn. The rain gave everything a sheen, the trees glistening, the creek swollen and whispering more fervently. The sound of it felt alive, like the land was speaking in its own quiet tone. Evelyn sipped her tea, her fingers curled around the warm mug. Her eyes followed the ripples on the creek, tracing the gentle movement of fallen leaves floating downstream. They moved so effortlessly, guided by the current, not resisting, just flowing. It made her think of herself. How much of her life had been spent resisting change, holding too tightly to the things she couldn't keep. She breathed deeply, feeling the damp air fill her lungs. The smell of earth and smoke felt grounding, real. Behind her, something creaked. The porch step, one of the old boards, shifting under the weight of the wind. But the sound pulled her attention toward the side of the cabin, to a place she hadn't explored yet. She followed it slowly, her mug still in hand, the rain dotting her cardigan with faint silver. There, near the edge of the porch, she found something unexpected, a small, square panel of wood that looked newer than the rest. The grain didn't quite match, and it was attached with shiny nails rather than the old rusted ones the rest of the cabin bore. Evelyn crouched down, brushing her hand over the damp surface. Curiosity bloomed quietly inside her. She tugged at the edge of the panel, and after a moment's effort, it loosened. Behind it, nestled in the hollow of the wall, was a small tin box, sealed tight but clearly aged by years of weather. Evelyn hesitated, then smiled to herself. "Well, I suppose you've been waiting long enough," she murmured softly, setting the box on the porch railing. The latch was stiff, but it opened with a soft click. Inside were several folded sheets of yellowed paper, bound with twine, and something else, a small brass key, worn and smooth. She lifted the papers gently, her breath catching as she saw her grandmother's handwriting. The letters were dated more than 30 years ago. The first one began simply, "If you're reading this, it means the creek has found its way to you again." Evelyn sat down, her heart warming and tightening all at once. Her grandmother's voice seemed to fill the air, each word like a whisper from another time. The letter spoke of life here at Willow Creek, of quiet winters, slow mornings, laughter echoing by the fire. But they also spoke of dreams. Her grandmother had written about wanting to open a small retreat someday, a place where weary hearts could come to rest, where the world slowed down long enough for people to remember who they were. There were sketches of the cabin layout, notes about a garden by the creek, even recipes for the bread she used to bake. But one line, near the end, struck Evelyn hardest. "If you ever feel lost, come back here. The creek remembers us. It always will." Tears welled up softly in Evelyn's eyes. It was as though her grandmother had written directly to her, as though she'd known, even decades ago, that this moment would come. She closed the letter gently, setting it on her lap. The rain was falling harder now, steady but soothing, like the world was washing itself clean. Evelyn leaned back against the porch post, letting the rhythm of it carry her thoughts away. The brass key gleamed faintly in her palm. She didn't know what it unlocked. Maybe a chest in the attic, maybe an old trunk somewhere in the cabin. But it didn't matter, not right now. What mattered was that she wasn't alone. The past had found her, but not to haunt her, to hold her. She smiled through her tears, whispering softly to the rain, "I'll take care of it. I promise." When the storm finally eased, the clouds broke apart into delicate patches, and rays of sunlight began to spill through. The air shimmered with mist, the scent of pine richer now, alive. Evelyn stood and walked back inside, placing the letters carefully on the mantel beside an old lantern. The cabin felt brighter, fuller, as if her grandmother's spirit had settled back in, curling by the fire, humming a familiar tune. Evelyn brewed another pot of tea, her movements unhurried, her heart light. The world outside sparkled, and through the window, she could see the creek glinting in the returning sunlight, flowing endlessly forward. She picked up her grandmother's recipe book from the shelf and smiled. "All right," she said softly, "let's bake something for the morning." She tied her hair back, rolled up her sleeves, and began to knead the dough, flour dusting her fingers, butter soft under her palms. The cabin filled with warmth again, the smell of fresh bread soon mingling with the sweetness of rain and smoke. And when the bread was done, she carried a small piece outside, breaking it gently and tossing it into the creek. "For you," she whispered, smiling at the ripples as they carried it away. Then she sat quietly by the fire again, the rain now just a memory, and let her eyes close. The soft hum of the creek drifted in through the window, and somewhere deep in her chest, peace settled like a gentle light. Willow Creek had given her what she didn't even know she needed: rest, memory, and the quiet reminder that even when the world moves on, love remains. It lingers in the scent of the rain, in the warmth of the fire, in the soft hush of the water that never stops singing. And as the day faded again into evening, Evelyn felt something she hadn't in years. Not just calm, but belonging. The sun drifted lazily toward the horizon, melting into soft streaks of gold and lavender across the sky. The air outside Willow Creek shimmered with that unmistakable stillness that comes just before twilight, a pause in the rhythm of the world, as though even the wind held its breath to watch the evening arrive. Evelyn sat by the window, her chin resting lightly on her palm, watching the light scatter across the rippling creek. She had been here for nearly a week now, though time had folded in on itself in this quiet place. Each day seemed to slip softly into the next. Morning tea, walks through the dew-laden grass, small fires that whispered their warmth into the cabin's wooden bones. There was no rush, no noise, no digital hum. Just the heartbeat of the land and her own breathing, slow and unhurried. Tonight, though, something felt different. The air carried a sweetness she couldn't quite name, as if the world itself was preparing to say something. The willow branches swayed gently in the cool breeze, their leaves glinting with the last light of day. The sky deepened, turning from gold to rose to the faintest blue-gray, and one by one, the stars began to appear. Evelyn lit the fire again, coaxing the embers to life. The flames rose slowly, stretching, flickering, then settling into a rhythmic dance that filled the cabin with a soft glow. The smell of burning pine curled through the air, earthy and comforting. She poured herself another cup of tea, chamomile, her grandmother's favorite, and carried it to the old rocking chair near the hearth. As she sat, the logs shifted and crackled, sending tiny sparks up the chimney. The warmth seeped into her legs, her arms, her chest, and soon she felt her breath matching the steady rhythm of the fire. The flames reflected in her eyes, soft and liquid. For a long time, she said nothing. She simply listened, to the wind sighing through the eaves, to the creek murmuring its endless lullaby, to the faint echo of something beyond sound, memory. Her grandmother's voice came to her not as words, but as warmth. That same warmth she had always felt when she was small, wrapped in wool blankets, half asleep by the fireplace while her grandmother hummed. The sound had no melody, just a kind of gentle rise and fall, the kind that could rock a restless heart to stillness. Evelyn closed her eyes. She could almost hear it now, the old song her grandmother used to hum while baking bread or mending quilts, something wordless and ancient. She began to hum it softly to herself, her voice barely a whisper, and for a moment, it was as if time folded completely, the years vanishing between them. The fire snapped softly, as if in response. Outside, the rain began again, light and deliberate, not stormy, just a soft pattering that blended perfectly with the fire's crackle. It was the kind of rain that seemed to know its place, content to stay in rhythm with the earth. The sound filled every space, wrapping around the cabin like a lullaby. Evelyn breathed in deeply, and her shoulders fell as a calm unlike anything she'd ever known began to sink into her bones. She thought of her life before Willow Creek, the long days, the late nights, the endless rush of noise and expectation. She thought of the emails unanswered, the meetings that filled her calendar, the constant hum of traffic outside her apartment window. All of it felt impossibly far away now. Here, there was no clock, no pressure, only the hush of the creek, the sigh of the rain, the voice of the fire. She reached for her grandmother's letters again, unfolding one she hadn't yet read. The ink had faded, but the handwriting was steady, each curve and loop unmistakable. Her grandmother wrote of love, loss, and patience, of learning to listen to silence without fear. The world, one line read, is never really quiet. You just have to slow down enough to hear it speak. Evelyn traced the words with her fingertip. They felt alive, pulsing faintly beneath her skin. A faint rustling came from outside, and she looked up, her gaze catching the flicker of something just beyond the porch, light, soft, and moving. She rose quietly, the floorboards creaking beneath her bare feet, and stepped toward the door. The air was cooler now, the rain a mist that kissed her face. The night had deepened, but she could see the faint glow of lanterns. One, then two, then three, swinging gently in the breeze by the edge of the creek. They must have been remnants from her grandmother's time, perhaps old festival lamps she'd forgotten. But now, as they swayed, they cast trembling circles of golden light onto the water. Evelyn stood there for a long time, her breath catching. The scene was so serene, so otherworldly, that it felt like stepping into a dream. She could almost imagine her grandmother standing there too, in the reflection of the creek, smiling quietly beneath her shawl. She whispered, "I found them." The lanterns flickered gently, as though answering her. She stayed there until the chill of the night wrapped around her shoulders, then returned to the cabin. The fire was still burning low, patient and alive. She added another log, watching it catch, the flames curling around it like old friends reunited. Curling beneath her quilt, Evelyn listened as the rain deepened once more, the rhythm soft and steady. The scent of smoke and tea filled her lungs as her eyes grew heavy. The world outside seemed to fade into one long, continuous sigh. Her breathing slowed. Her mind wandered. Somewhere in the space between waking and sleep, she found herself back by the creek. Only this time, her grandmother was there. Her presence wasn't sharp or ghostly. It was warm, like sunlight seen through closed eyelids. She smiled at Evelyn, her eyes kind, and held out her hand. Together, they walked along the water's edge. The sky above shimmered faintly, and the sound of the creek seemed to speak in a language Evelyn now understood. A language of peace, of continuity, of soft returning. When she awoke, the morning light was pale and gentle. The rain had stopped. The world smelled clean, new, reborn. The lanterns outside still glowed faintly, though she couldn't say how. Maybe they'd burned all night. Maybe they were something else entirely. She smiled to herself, a small, knowing smile. Fireside at Willow Creek wasn't just a place she realized. It was a rhythm, a heartbeat, a reminder. A space where the noise of the world faded, and only the essentials remained. Warmth, memory, love. Evelyn stood, wrapped herself in her cardigan, and walked outside to greet the new day. The willows swayed gently, their branches catching the early sun. The creek sparkled, alive with motion. And somewhere deep in her chest, she felt it, the same soft hum that had filled her dreams. The hum of her grandmother's lullaby, the hum of the land that had always known her, even before she'd found her way back. She whispered to the wind, "Thank you," and the creek answered in kind, a slow, peaceful murmur like the sound of eternity breathing. The morning at Willow Creek arrived gently, the way all peaceful mornings should. The light filtered through the willows like liquid gold, slipping between the narrow leaves and scattering soft shadows over the damp grass. The air smelled of pine, smoke, and wild mint. Birds called lazily across the water, their songs rising and falling like breaths in a lullaby. Evelyn stepped outside, cradling a mug of tea between her palms. The steam curled into the air, catching in the morning light. She sat down on the porch steps, her eyes tracing the gentle sway of the creek. It was wider than she remembered, maybe because of the night's rain, or maybe because she was seeing it differently now. Everything here had changed, and yet remained the same, carrying the weight of memory, but offering renewal all the same. She took a slow sip, letting the warmth spread through her chest. The fire inside the cabin was still glowing faintly, casting its last embers of night. For a moment, she thought of her life before all this. The restless city lights, the endless deadlines, the constant noise that left no room for stillness. She remembered how heavy her heart had felt back then, like a stone sinking in cold water. But here, the heaviness had lifted, not because she'd escaped, but because she'd remembered how to be still enough to feel alive again. The soft splash of the creek pulled her from her thoughts. She looked up to see a family of ducks gliding along the surface, their feathers slick and shiny. The smallest one struggled to keep up, flapping furiously before settling into the rhythm of the water. Evelyn smiled. "That's it," she whispered to the little one. "Don't rush. Just float." She stayed like that for a long time, long enough for the sun to rise higher, for the mist to thin, for the world to awaken slowly around her. Every sound here had its own patience. The creak of the porch boards, the whisper of wind through leaves, the distant hum of the forest waking. It was a place built on rhythm and calm, a place where even silence felt full. After breakfast, she began cleaning the small attic above the cabin. Dust drifted in lazy spirals as she opened the narrow window, letting in light and air. The smell of cedar and age filled the room. There were boxes stacked neatly along one wall, most of them labeled in her grandmother's looping handwriting. Linens, quilts, winter herbs, letters. She knelt beside one marked Simply Dreams. Her fingers hesitated on the lid. The box creaked softly as she lifted it open. Inside were papers, sketches, and a small journal. On the first page was her grandmother's handwriting again, the ink faded but graceful. Ideas for the retreat at Willow Creek. Evelyn turned the pages slowly, her breath catching with every line. There were notes about cottages, walking trails, a garden of lavender and thyme, a large stone fire pit by the water where people could gather. A place, one line read, for souls that have forgotten how to rest. The words echoed deep within her. She closed the journal gently and pressed her palm against the cover. "I'll finish it," she whispered. "I'll make it real." For the next few weeks, she worked quietly, moving through each day with purpose. She cleared the land around the cabin, tidied the garden, repaired the old wooden bridge that crossed the creek. The air was filled with the scent of sawdust and rain, of baking bread and blooming herbs. Every evening, when the light turned amber and the fire called her home, she'd sit by the hearth and read another of her grandmother's letters, finding pieces of herself hidden in every line. Sometimes the nights brought storms. The rain would pour hard against the roof, wind rushing through the trees. But instead of fear, Evelyn felt comfort in it. The storm was the land's heartbeat, wild, alive, cleansing. She would sit by the fire, eyes half closed, listening to the rain drum its rhythm on the earth. It reminded her that peace wasn't always quiet. Sometimes it was simply knowing you were safe, even when the world raged outside. Months passed like that, softly, steadily. The cabin became something more than shelter. It became a companion, breathing with her, watching with her. She'd talk aloud sometimes, to the fire or the creek, to the ghost of her grandmother she still felt around her. And when she laughed, it didn't echo with loneliness anymore. It blended perfectly with the hum of the land. Word began to spread, slowly at first, through friends, then strangers who had heard a little place by a creek where people could come and rest. She didn't advertise it. She didn't need to. Those who needed Willow Creek always seemed to find it. One morning, she woke to the sound of tires crunching over gravel. A woman stepped out of a small blue car, her eyes red from sleeplessness. She stood by the porch, clutching a duffel bag. Evelyn greeted her with a soft smile. "You're in the right place," she said simply. That was the beginning. Over time, more people came. Artists who had forgotten how to dream, teachers burned out by endless days, widowers seeking quiet, travelers searching for something they couldn't name. Evelyn offered them tea, a room, silence, and the crackle of the fire. Some stayed a night, some stayed a week. All of them left lighter than when they arrived. Each evening, they'd gather by the creek as the fire pit glowed, the sound of the water blending with the whispers of the flame. There were no grand speeches, no deep confessions, just the warmth of being seen, of being still. Evelyn often watched them with quiet pride, her heart full. This was her grandmother's dream come alive. On one such evening, as twilight deepened and the fire cast long golden arcs over the faces around her, Evelyn looked up to see the willows swaying gently, their leaves shimmering like silver threads. A soft breeze carried the scent of rain and wild herbs. The creek hummed its eternal song. She felt her grandmother there, not as a ghost, not as a memory, but as presence itself. The warmth in the fire, the stillness in the air, the whisper in the leaves. She closed her eyes, the murmur of the group fading into a serene hush. For a moment, she felt herself weightless, part of the air, the water, the firelight. The peace that filled her then was beyond words, beyond thought. It was pure being. When she opened her eyes again, the first stars had appeared, shimmering faintly over the treetops. She smiled, her eyes glistening in the glow of the flames. "Thank you," she whispered into the night, "for bringing me home." The creek responded with its quiet song. The willows rustled softly, and the fire snapped, as if the whole world were answering back in its own gentle language of light and sound. That night, the stars over Willow Creek shone like 1,000 tiny lanterns scattered across an indigo sea. The fire by the porch burned low, its flames whispering in the hush of the woods. Evelyn sat by it, her knees tucked beneath a wool blanket, a cup of chamomile tea steaming beside her. The air was cool and smelled faintly of smoke and blooming night jasmine. The world had fallen silent except for the creek murmuring nearby, its gentle current catching slivers of starlight. Every sound, the soft crackle of the logs, the distant call of an owl, the slow rhythm of her own breath, felt perfectly in tune, as though nature itself were humming a lullaby. She held a leather-bound notebook in her lap, one that had belonged to her grandmother. Its pages were nearly full now, filled with Evelyn's careful handwriting. Notes about guests, sketches of the gardens, recipes for the morning pastries, and small observations of life at Willow Creek. But tonight, she had opened to the very last page. Her pen hovered above it, trembling slightly, as if unsure whether to disturb the stillness of the moment. She began to write. "Dear Grandma," she wrote slowly, her hand steadying with each stroke. "I think you knew what this place would become before I ever did. You must have felt it, the way the light moves here, the way the wind carries peace. I used to think I came here to hide, to escape the noise of everything I couldn't bear anymore. But now I see it. You didn't build this place to hide. You built it to heal." A breeze stirred the flames, sending tiny sparks spiraling into the night sky. Evelyn paused, watching them drift upward until they disappeared among the stars. "The people who come here," she continued, "they don't all say much. Some of them barely speak at all. But when they leave, there's something in their eyes, something softer, something lighter. I think it's hope. The same hope you must have felt when you first dreamed of this place. I've kept your promise, Grandma. The fire still burns every night, and the creek still sings. Willow Creek is alive again." Her handwriting slowed. "Sometimes I still hear your voice in the mornings, soft, like the hum of the kettle before it boils. And sometimes, when the wind blows through the willows, I swear it's you reminding me to breathe. I miss you, but I don't feel alone. Not anymore." She signed her name with a small flourish, then closed the notebook gently, pressing her palm over it as though sealing the words into the wood and air of the place. The fire had burned down to a glow, its embers pulsing like a heartbeat. She sat quietly, feeling the warmth of it touch her skin, the softness of the night pressing around her. She lifted her gaze to the stars again. There was a stillness there, not empty, but full. The kind of stillness that only exists when everything is exactly as it should be. She thought about the lives that had touched this place, the laughter that had filled the mornings, the tears that had been released by the water's edge. Every story, every soul had become part of the land. When the fire had dimmed to coals, Evelyn stood, wrapping the blanket around her shoulders. She walked slowly toward the creek. The moon hung low, turning the surface of the water into molten silver. She crouched by the bank, scooping a handful of the cold, clear stream into her palms. It reflected her face, calm, older now, wiser but peaceful. She let the water slip through her fingers, its coolness trailing away like the last line of a lullaby. From somewhere deep in the woods, the wind began to stir. It carried the scent of rain and pine, rustling through the willows in long, sighing breaths. The trees swayed gently, as if bowing in rhythm to the quiet music of the world. Evelyn smiled softly. She knew that this place didn't belong to her alone. It was alive in ways that transcended ownership. She was merely part of its story, just as her grandmother had been before her, just as others would be after. She returned to the porch, where the last ember of the fire glowed faintly. She poured herself another cup of tea, the steam curling upward like a ribbon of memory. The cup warmed her hands as she leaned back in the rocking chair, her gaze distant, dreamy. The rhythm of the chair creaked in time with the song of the crickets. The creek gurgled softly, and the night wrapped around her like a shawl. Sleep came slowly, not in a rush, but in a gentle drift, like falling into the arms of something familiar and kind. In her dreams, she stood at the edge of Willow Creek. Only this time, her grandmother was there beside her. The old woman's eyes sparkled with warmth, her smile tender. Together, they watched the sunrise spill over the water, painting it in shades of gold and rose. "You've done beautifully," her grandmother whispered, her voice like a melody in the dawn. Evelyn turned to answer, but the dream began to dissolve into light, soft, shimmering light that touched everything around her. She woke with the sun on her face, the air cool and bright. The fire had gone out, but the warmth lingered. For a long while, she just sat there, watching as the first morning mist rose from the creek. Birds fluttered from branch to branch, and the willows glittered with dew. Everything was so alive, so impossibly gentle. She rose, stretching her arms toward the new day. There was work to do, bread to bake, gardens to tend, guests to welcome. But for now, she let herself breathe in the moment, the scent of morning tea mingling with earth and water and sky. This was home, not because of the walls or the land, but because of what it had become, a place where hearts remembered how to rest. As the sun lifted higher, its light touched the old sign by the path, carved carefully by her grandmother decades ago. Willow Creek Retreat. Fireside, always burning. Evelyn smiled, brushing her fingers over the weathered letters. "Always," she whispered. Then she walked toward the kitchen, the sound of her steps soft and rhythmic, like the heartbeat of the place itself. The morning mist at Willow Creek lifted slowly, like a curtain rising on a gentle stage. The first rays of sunlight slipped through the willows, scattering diamonds across the water. Evelyn stood on the porch with her hands wrapped around a steaming mug of tea, her breath curling in soft clouds that drifted away into the dawn. The scent of pine and damp earth filled her lungs, grounding her in the stillness of another day beginning. She watched as the world came alive in small, unhurried movements, a bluebird landing on the railing, the creek whispering softly over smooth stones, the faint sound of wood crackling in the hearth behind her. The cottage, her sanctuary, was awake again, and so was she. Inside, the scent of fresh dough and cinnamon filled the air. Evelyn moved quietly, her slippers brushing against the wooden floorboards. The kitchen was her favorite place in the house, the heart of Willow Creek. Its walls were lined with jars of herbs and spices, and a large window above the sink framed the landscape like a living painting. The sunlight filtered in, turning the steam from the kettle into golden ribbons. She kneaded the dough rhythmically, each press and fold releasing a calm, meditative peace. It wasn't just baking, it was a ritual, a kind of morning prayer. The bread would rise slowly while the world warmed, and by the time the guests wandered down from their rooms, the entire cottage would smell of home. Outside, the creek continued its soft song, mingling with the rustle of willow leaves. A pair of ducks drifted lazily along the bank, unbothered by the world beyond. Evelyn watched them for a moment through the window, smiling faintly. When the first guest appeared, a middle-aged man named Arthur, who had arrived 3 nights earlier. He greeted her with a nod and a soft good morning. His face looked more relaxed now, the sharpness in his eyes softened by rest. He had come to Willow Creek seeking quiet after a long, bitter year. Evelyn hadn't asked for details. Here, no one needed to explain. The stillness had a way of drawing out whatever needed to heal. "Coffee?" she asked gently. He nodded. "Please." She poured him a cup, the rich aroma filling the space between them. They sat together at the wooden table near the fire, not speaking much. The silence was comfortable, the kind that didn't demand to be filled. After a while, Arthur exhaled deeply and said, "You know, I used to wake up every morning with noise. Traffic, phones, people. Here, it's just quiet." Evelyn finished for him. He smiled. "Yes, and somehow it's enough." Evelyn smiled too. That's what Willow Creek does, she said softly. It teaches you how to hear the quiet again. As the morning stretched into afternoon, she tended to the small garden behind the house. Rows of lavender and rosemary grew wild around the edges, and clusters of daisies nodded in the breeze. She worked with her hands in the soil, feeling the cool, damp earth cling to her fingertips. The rhythm of planting, watering, and trimming was slow and satisfying. There was no rush here. Everything grew in its own time. By midday, the sun had climbed high, and the sound of the creek had deepened. Evelyn carried a woven basket filled with herbs and freshly baked bread to the picnic table near the water. The guests, a young woman named Claire, an older couple, and Arthur, joined her there. They ate together beneath the willows, laughter mingling with the rustle of the leaves. Claire had come from the city, exhausted by years of chasing things that no longer mattered. She told Evelyn quietly, "I used to dream of silence. I didn't know it could sound this beautiful." Evelyn nodded. "Silence has its own music," she said. "You just have to be still long enough to hear it." After lunch, the group wandered down to the creek to dip their feet in the cool water. The sun shimmered on the surface like a field of stars, and dragonflies danced in the air. Evelyn watched them from the porch, her heart full in a way she hadn't felt for years. Willow Creek wasn't just her grandmother's legacy anymore. It was alive with new stories, new souls finding peace. When dusk began to fall, Evelyn lit the fire pit beside the porch. The sky turned violet, then deep blue, and the first stars appeared. The guests gathered, each wrapped in a blanket, holding mugs of cocoa or tea. The crackle of the fire filled the spaces between their quiet voices. Evelyn looked around at their faces illuminated by the soft glow. There was something magical about this hour, when the world slowed enough to remember itself. Arthur leaned back in his chair and said, almost to himself, "I think I'll remember this sound for the rest of my life." Claire smiled faintly. "The fire?" He shook his head. "No, the quiet. It feels like it's healing something I didn't even know was broken." Evelyn said nothing, but her heart swelled. Later that night, when the fire had burned low and the guests had gone to their rooms, Evelyn sat alone again beneath the stars. The air was cool and smelled faintly of smoke and pine. She could hear the creek in the distance, the steady, gentle voice of time itself. She closed her eyes and breathed deeply. Memories flickered in her mind. Her grandmother's laughter, the first loaf she ever baked here, the moment she decided to stay after years of running. She had once feared the silence, afraid it might swallow her. But now she understood it wasn't emptiness. It was presence, the kind that cradled you softly until you remembered who you were. The moon rose high above the willows, and its light spread across the water like silk. Evelyn sat for a long while, listening to the fire's sigh, until sleep began to pull at her gently. Tomorrow, she would wake early again. She would bake bread, watch the mist lift, and greet new travelers seeking peace. And as long as the fire at Willow Creek kept burning, there would always be warmth waiting for them. The morning mist at Willow Creek lifted slowly, like a curtain rising on a gentle stage. The first rays of sunlight slipped through the willows, scattering diamonds across the water. Evelyn stood on the porch with her hands wrapped around a steaming mug of tea, her breath curling in soft clouds that drifted away into the dawn. The scent of pine and damp earth filled her lungs, grounding her in the stillness of another day beginning. She watched as the world came alive in small, unhurried movements, a bluebird landing on the railing, the creek whispering softly over smooth stones, the faint sound of wood crackling in the hearth behind her. The cottage, her sanctuary, was awake again, and so was she. Inside, the scent of fresh dough and cinnamon filled the air. Evelyn moved quietly, her slippers brushing against the wooden floorboards. The kitchen was her favorite place in the house, the heart of Willow Creek. Its walls were lined with jars of herbs and spices, and a large window above the sink framed the landscape like a living painting. The sunlight filtered in, turning the steam from the kettle into golden ribbons. She kneaded the dough rhythmically, each press and fold releasing a calm, meditative peace. It wasn't just baking, It was a ritual, a kind of morning prayer. The bread would rise slowly while the world warmed, and by the time the guests wandered down from their rooms, the entire cottage would smell of home. Outside, the creek continued its soft song, mingling with the rustle of willow leaves. A pair of ducks drifted lazily along the bank, unbothered by the world beyond. Evelyn watched them for a moment through the window, smiling faintly. When the first guest appeared, a middle-aged man named Arthur, who had arrived 3 nights earlier. He greeted her with a nod and a soft good morning. His face looked more relaxed now, the sharpness in his eyes softened by rest. He had come to Willow Creek seeking quiet after a long, bitter year. Evelyn hadn't asked for details. Here, no one needed to explain. The stillness had a way of drawing out whatever needed to heal. "Coffee?" she asked gently. He nodded. "Please." She poured him a cup, the rich aroma filling the space between them. They sat together at the wooden table near the fire, not speaking much. The silence was comfortable, the kind that didn't demand to be filled. After a while, Arthur exhaled deeply and said, "You know, I used to wake up every morning with noise. Traffic, phones, people. Here, it's just quiet." Evelyn finished for him. He smiled. "Yes, and somehow it's enough." Evelyn smiled too. "That's what Willow Creek does," she said softly. "It teaches you how to hear the quiet again." As the morning stretched into afternoon, she tended to the small garden behind the house. Rows of lavender and rosemary grew wild around the edges, and clusters of daisies nodded in the breeze. She worked with her hands in the soil, feeling the cool, damp earth cling to her fingertips. The rhythm of planting, watering, and trimming was slow and satisfying. There was no rush here. Everything grew in its own time. By midday, the sun had climbed high, and the sound of the creek had deepened. Evelyn carried a woven basket filled with herbs and freshly baked bread to the picnic table near the water. The guests, a young woman named Claire, an older couple, and Arthur, joined her there. They ate together beneath the willows, laughter mingling with the rustle of the leaves. Claire had come from the city, exhausted by years of chasing things that no longer mattered. She told Evelyn quietly, "I used to dream of silence. I didn't know it could sound this beautiful." Evelyn nodded. "Silence has its own music," she said. "You just have to be still long enough to hear it." After lunch, the group wandered down to the creek to dip their feet in the cool water. The sun shimmered on the surface like a field of stars, and dragonflies danced in the air. Evelyn watched them from the porch, her heart full in a way she hadn't felt for years. Willow Creek wasn't just her grandmother's legacy anymore. It was alive with new stories, new souls finding peace. When dusk began to fall, Evelyn lit the fire pit beside the porch. The sky turned violet, then deep blue, and the first stars appeared. The guests gathered, each wrapped in a blanket, holding mugs of cocoa or tea. The crackle of the fire filled the spaces between their quiet voices. Evelyn looked around at their faces illuminated by the soft glow. There was something magical about this hour, when the world slowed enough to remember itself. Arthur leaned back in his chair and said, almost to himself, "I think I'll remember this sound for the rest of my life." Claire smiled faintly. "The fire?" He shook his head. "No, the quiet. It feels like it's healing something I didn't even know was broken." Evelyn said nothing, but her heart swelled. Later that night, when the fire had burned low and the guests had gone to their rooms, Evelyn sat alone again beneath the stars. The air was cool and smelled faintly of smoke and pine. She could hear the creek in the distance, the steady, gentle voice of time itself. She closed her eyes and breathed deeply. Memories flickered in her mind. Her grandmother's laughter, the first loaf she ever baked here, the moment she decided to stay after years of running. She had once feared the silence, afraid it might swallow her. But now she understood it wasn't emptiness. It was presence, the kind that cradled you softly until you remembered who you were. The moon rose high above the willows, and its light spread across the water like silk. Evelyn sat for a long while, listening to the fire sigh, until sleep began to pull at her gently. Tomorrow, she would wake early again. She would bake bread, watch the mist lift, and greet new travelers seeking peace. And as long as the fire at Willow Creek kept burning, there would always be warmth waiting for them. The moonlight deepened over Willow Creek as the night matured, draping the world in silver. Evelyn lingered on the porch long after everyone had gone to bed. The embers in the fire pit pulsed softly, their glow reflected in her eyes. The rhythmic murmur of the creek, the occasional sigh of wind through the willows, and the quiet, steady beat of her heart created a symphony so gentle that she felt it could lull the stars themselves to sleep. She tilted her head back, watching the sky open above her. The Milky Way spilled across the heavens, a ribbon of quiet brilliance, like powdered light scattered by invisible hands. Out here, there were no streetlights, no cars, no sirens. Just the deep, unbroken hush of night and the feeling that time itself had slowed to breathe beside her. She remembered something her grandmother used to say, "At Willow Creek, every sound has a story. You just have to listen long enough to hear it." Evelyn smiled faintly. The fire crackled again, and she thought she could almost hear a whisper within it, something ancient and kind. As the night deepened, she rose, brushed off her blanket, and stepped barefoot into the cool grass. Dew had already begun to settle, and the blades shimmered like tiny pearls. She walked toward the edge of the creek, the water reflecting the moonlight in rippling patterns that danced across her face. Kneeling, she dipped her fingers into the water. It was cold but welcoming. "This place remembers," she murmured softly. "It always does." The creek answered with a soft trickle, as though it agreed. When Evelyn returned to her room, she left the window open. The curtains fluttered gently in the night breeze, carrying in the scent of pine smoke and wildflowers. She slid beneath the quilt, feeling the soft hum of peace settling into her bones. As she drifted toward sleep, she could still hear the faint pop of the dying fire outside, like the heartbeat of Willow Creek itself, steady and eternal. The next morning, the world was painted in mist again. Sunlight filtered through it in long, golden shafts, touching the tops of the willows. Evelyn rose quietly, her movements slow and graceful, as though she didn't want to disturb the fragile beauty of dawn. She brewed her tea and took it outside, watching as the fog began to lift from the surface of the water. The ducks were already awake, gliding across the glassy surface, leaving perfect ripples behind them. Somewhere in the trees, a thrush began to sing, its clear, bright notes echoing through the valley. Evelyn closed her eyes and listened. The melody was old and familiar, one her grandmother used to hum while hanging herbs to dry. By the time the guests began to stir, the sun had risen higher. The cottage came alive again, soft footsteps in the hallway, the clink of mugs, quiet laughter from the porch. Evelyn moved among them like a calm current, offering breakfast, sharing smiles. She didn't speak much, and she didn't need to. People came to Willow Creek to unlearn the noise of their lives. That afternoon, Arthur joined her in the garden. He helped her trim the lavender bushes, his hands steady but gentle. He told her about his late wife, how she used to keep a small garden on their balcony in the city. She'd have loved this place, he said quietly. Evelyn smiled and nodded, her heart warming at his words. "She's still here," Evelyn said softly, handing him a sprig of lavender. Every scent, every color, they're reminders. Maybe that's why the garden grows so well. It remembers love. Arthur held the lavender close to his chest and nodded. The silence that followed was not sad. It was full, sacred, the kind that held the memory of laughter and the promise of peace. That evening, when the sun dipped low again, Evelyn lit the fire. The sky blushed with gold and crimson before fading into deep blue. The willows swayed gently, their leaves whispering as if in conversation with the wind. The guests gathered once more, drawn to the warmth like moths to a flame. Claire brought out her sketchbook and began to draw, her pencil moving lightly over the paper. The older couple shared a blanket and leaned into each other, their faces reflecting the glow of the flames. Arthur sat quietly, sipping his tea, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Evelyn looked at them and felt a wave of tenderness wash over her. They had each arrived here burdened with grief, with exhaustion, with questions. And now, one by one, she watched those burdens melt away like frost beneath the morning sun. She told them an old story her grandmother had once shared about how the creek was born from a tear of the moon, and that's why its water shimmered even in the darkest nights. Her voice was soft and steady, weaving through the crackle of the fire and the sigh of the wind. As she spoke, the night deepened around them. The stars bloomed overhead, the air thick with the scent of burning cedar. Every sound, the soft lapping of water, the hush of the trees, seemed to lean in closer, as if listening. When the story ended, no one spoke. They simply sat there, breathing together, their hearts beating in the same slow rhythm. It was one of those rare moments where silence became a kind of language, where words would only break the spell. The fire burned lower, its embers glowing like scattered jewels. Evelyn felt the familiar pull of sleep in her limbs, but she stayed awake a little longer, watching the last spark fade into the ash. In the days that followed, Willow Creek continued its gentle rhythm. Some guests left, their eyes brighter than when they arrived. Others came, drawn by whispers of a place where time seemed to stop. Evelyn greeted them all the same way, with warmth, with tea, with a quiet understanding that they didn't need to explain why they were here. One evening, when the air had turned crisp and the first signs of autumn painted the willows gold, Evelyn sat by the fire alone again. She wrapped herself in her grandmother's shawl and listened to the night. The creek murmured softly, the fire sighed, and the stars blinked lazily above. She closed her eyes, breathing in the moment. There was nothing she needed to fix, nothing she needed to chase. Just the warmth, the quiet, and the feeling of belonging, not to the world, but to this gentle corner of it. And as the firelight danced across her face, Evelyn smiled to herself. Willow Creek had a way of mending what the world broke. It didn't rush. It didn't demand. It simply existed, calm, eternal, waiting,